Hello everyone. Thank you for taking a few moments to view this video on the threats to external validity. As we get started with this content, I do want to let you know that our content from the threats to internal validity and what we're going to talk about today both relate to how we design an experiment. So what I'd like us to do here is to establish the question of external validity. And if you happen to have your worksheet that goes along with this, please feel free to pull that out and we can take some notes here together. So the question of external validity is one that's very unique, and we'll kind of see why. It would ask, can the results of my experiment be applied to other people and or to other settings? So again, can the results of my experiment be applied to other people and or to other settings? Now, in experimental research, we define these two things a little bit separately. So when we talk about applying the results of an experiment to other people, we have a certain term for that, and we refer to that as population validity. And when we hear a discussion about applying the results of a study to other settings, we refer to that as ecological validity. So let's put this in part for just a second. When we talk about internal validity, we're really concerned with the way or the manner in which we design an experiment. And when we talk about external validity, we're more concerned with how the results of our experiment can be applied again to other people or to other settings. So, as we kind of examine this question, we're going to look at some things that threaten our ability to take our results from an experiment and say that it can be true for other people or other settings. So let's look at our very first description here. It says the reactive and interactive effects. Now, what this refers to is a concept that we have talked about previously. This relates to the testing effect. And if you'll remember in our discussion on threats to internal validity, this testing effect was one by which we said a pretest may impact how well a participant performs. And so what we're going to do as it relates to this threat for external validity is really expound on that. And so I'll give you a description here and then we'll write this together. Now, a pretest can have either one or two effects on a study. So think about it this way. If you were to take a pretest for a course, that pretest may encourage you about the course. You may feel like, wow, I can do this, or this class won't be very difficult. But a pretest could also discourage you. It could make you feel as though you're not prepared, and it could give the impression that the course will be very difficult. So that's what we're saying here when we talk about this threat to external validity. We're saying that a pretest can either positively or negatively influence the results of a study. So we'll put it this way for our description. We'll say that a pretest may encourage or discourage a participant which can negatively or positively skew the results of the study. So again, a pretest may encourage or discourage a participant, which can negatively or positively skew the results of the study. So let's take a look at the second one here. It says the interaction of selection bias and experimental treatment. So what I'd like to do here is to bring your attention to this word, selection bias. And so hopefully you'll remember that in our discussion on threats to internal validity, selection bias was a threat. And so remember that selection bias means that we've formed groups for either the treatment group or the control group without utilizing randomization. So let me give you an example here that may hopefully make this a little bit clearer. And I'll write this in the space that we have here on the sheet. Let's take an experimental design here. This is going to be the non-equivalent control group. So our first group here is going to have a pretest, they'll have the treatment, and then they'll have an observation. So that's our first group. And then our second group will have an observation. We're going to give them a control, and then we're going to also give them an observation here. So let's think about it this way. Let's imagine that for this study, we want to compare the effectiveness of a online CPR course to a face-to-face CPR course. So for this example, our treatment here will be kind of the new thing. It'll be the thing that we're curious about. So we would make our treatment here, this is going to be our online CPR course. And we'll make our constant or our control group, we'll make this the face-to-face CPR course. So notice that we have not utilized the letter R for either of these groups. So again, we have not utilized randomization. Now, let's kind of be a little nitpicky here for just a second. Let's imagine that the folks in this first group have taken CPR courses before. So we'll just say here, previously trained. And let's imagine that those in the second group have not taken a CPR course before. We'll just say that they are untrained. Well, so let's imagine that we carry out this study and we find out that our treatment group, which is our online CPR course, is very effective and that it's more effective than the face-to-face CPR course. Well, our results can be severely skewed here because the folks in this course have been previously trained. And so what if their previous training is what allowed them to do well on the exam, or what if their previous training is what gave them the confidence to perform CPR correctly? So what we're saying here is that the better way to conduct this study would be to add randomization. And if we add randomization to both groups, what we're doing is we're making sure that we have a good mix of people that have been previously trained and folks that have been untrained in both the treatment and control group. And when we do it that way, the characteristics of the group can't impact the outcome of the study. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's look at the third one here. The third one is called the reactive effects of the experimental setting. Now, what this refers to is a very broad general concept. And so I'm just going to go straight to our description here, and then we'll write it together. All this is referring to is the fact that sometimes experiments which are conducted in laboratories don't always translate well to a real world setting. So again, we can write that down together. We'll say that experiments conducted in a laboratory don't always translate well to a real world setting. And perhaps the best um, example that I can give you here is when we hear about experiments being conducted with mice and other animals. While we get a lot of information for that, sometimes transferring that content from the experiment to the real world is just a little bit more difficult. So perhaps the best example that I can give you here is studies that typically utilize animals to do medicine and or drug tests on. Well, researchers may find that it's effective in the mice or the animals that they're working with, but maybe that medicine isn't going to be as effective when it's utilized on humans. So that's something that we just have to consider, that sometimes what we find in a controlled, strict environment like a laboratory won't make that much sense or won't be as applicable to real life. Now, for this last one, it is called multiple treatment interference. And really, all this means is that previous or multiple treatments can affect future treatments. So let's go ahead and jot that down real quick. We're again saying that previous or multiple treatments can affect future treatments. So what this kind of goes back to is the fact that sometimes over inundating someone with something can either heighten or it can decrease their sensitivity to it again. So here's a very practical example, and you've probably heard of this before. You'll oftentimes hear people saying that they've been taking a medicine for a while and it just doesn't seem to be helping as well. Well, what happens is the body kind of almost adapts or it adjusts to what it's being given. So think about it like that. If we happen to have multiple treatments of something, it will usually lead to a decreased level of effectiveness of that particular treatment. That's it for this video on the threats to external validity. I hope this was helpful, and please don't hesitate to let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. Thank you.